Hamatakapi, this is Nick Estes, host of Red Scare. We are cross-streaming on several platforms right now. We're cross-streaming on Gabriel Rockhill's Substack. You can just go to substack.com and type in Gabriel Rockhil. You should be able to live stream it there. We're also live streaming on the Red Scare Substack, and we're live streaming on East is a Podcast as well as Red Nation's channels, just because this is an interview that I think is incredibly important at this moment in time. This book is a wonderful book. It's actually a follow-up conversation to our discussion of Domenico Lasurdo's book, Western Marxism. You can check that out at the Red Nation podcast. Gabriel Rockhil wrote the introduction to that particular book, but it was an eye-opening book and an eye-opening discussion. So getting this book was actually really amazing. And I'll tell you a little bit of history about this particular book. It was like, so I was frantically trying to order a copy of this book, and it just was not arriving in time. And so I actually ended up with 2 copies, which is good. I'm going to give a copy away to a friend. But I went to the bookstore, and I'm assuming it was the only copy that was left, and so I'm assuming that it was flying off the shelves because all the other copies around it had 6 or 7 stacks copies deep, and so
literally flying off the shelves.
Yeah, literally flying off the shelves. But I was actually surprised to see it at the bookstore so quickly, but also as it should be widely read. It should be engaged thoroughly, and that's why I'm just so happy to have Gabriel back on our platforms to talk about this book. Welcome, Gabriel. Maybe you can just give a brief background of yourself, but before you do, I just want to say really kudos on this book. I think it says a lot. I have a lot to say about it. The fact that you publish with a monthly review is amazing. I think Monthly Review has had such a rich tradition in the anti-imperialist Western left, but also more broadly in terms of thinking through a lot of these critical conversations. But I also just think that this book is very thoroughly researched. I was actually not surprised, but I was amazed at how many sources that you had cited in here, primary sources, doing archival research. You also have a section of this book that is an appendix that are photographed or scanned copies of the very materials, primary documents that are engaged in this book. But before I start just gloating about this book, I'll just turn it over to you if you want to do a quick introduction.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Nick. I've been a fan of your work for years, and I really admire the platforms that you've been developing. And so it's wonderful to reconnect. I'm a philosopher, cultural critic, engaged in various forms of activism. And the book that we're going to talk about took, a decade to write, but really the research is the last 3 decades or so of my life, because I was originally trained in the traditions of Western Marxism, French theory, contemporary radical theory, with a background in philosophy, but then also the historical social sciences. And it took me a while working through the academy to find the methodological horizons that were most appropriate for what I wanted to do. And those horizons can be defined as dialectical and historical materialism, but purged of the rather pernicious influences of certain aspects of Western Marxism. So that's at least a quick introduction. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think maybe we should start with sort of a definition of terms, because you engage dialectical historical materialism with such frequency in this book. It's your primary methodology. But it's so frequent within the book, you reduce it to an acronym. But maybe you can spell out why it's so central to understanding this history. Because what you could have done, you could have just done a documentarian history and chronicling, the influence of the CIA and Western intelligence agencies, primarily with the United States, on the theory industry and propping up, these Western Marxism as we know it today. And it could have been sort of, like an investigative piece, but you also go a step further and you kind of lay out over the course of dozens of pages the sort of methodology that you're employing, and why it's so important to understand not just this history, but also to, I would say, open up a sort of bravery in engaging it to understand other histories.
Thank you for that question. For me to undertake this project and do it in the manner that it needed to be done, it had to be framed within the positive project, meaning that it's a dialectical critique of knowledge production and the Western left intelligentsia in particular, as well as the global effects. But the reason for engaging in this critique isn't simply to stand on the sidelines and point out who had taken compromised positions on imperialism, capitalism, etc., but in order to actually then excavate the methodological framework that this tradition itself was pitted against, meaning the deep and rich tradition of dialectical and historical materialism that I'll get into a little bit more in a moment, that has been both the primary weapon of class struggle from below and the principal victim of the overwhelming support on the part of the empire, both the capitalist ruling class, the bourgeois state, and all of the institutions of knowledge production, their support for a version of Marxism that is ultimately anti-imperialist, which you don't have to take a graduate seminar on Hegel and the negation of the negation to figure out that if you're against anti-imperialism, well, you're pretty down with imperialism. And so that was essential. And it was also a way of, this project is, the last book that I published was almost a decade ago. And so I've basically been in the archives and in the streets figuring out how best to shift the horizons of my own work. And in tapping into the dialectical and historical materialist tradition, I identified the kind of breadth of the engagement that's necessary in order to shift the basic orientation of the Western left intelligentsia. And part of that is because I trained, as I mentioned a moment ago, both in philosophy and the historical social sciences. But as I go into in the book, the way in which these discourses operate within the imperial core is that they tend to either isolate intellectual producers and their products from the social relations of production. This is what you're trained in the humanities, is to basically traffic in cultural commodity fetishism. So you just worship a particular text, a particular author, and then you establish a career model based on that. That's what I was trained to do. Obviously, I was poorly trained because I didn't remain within that kind of rat's maze, if you will. In the historical social sciences, you open up the spectrum of analysis to engage in what people refer to as external analysis, contextualization, etc. But unfortunately, the bourgeois social sciences are also hemmed in by their subservience to the system of wage slavery and to capitalism, and they tend to as well naturalize, if not simply openly support, imperialism, and they've played a big role in doing precisely that. And so I wanted to mine deeper than the traditions that I was trained in. And one of the great advantages of the historical materialist tradition is that it recognizes that intellectual life is not driven primarily by isolated producers, but the producers themselves are produced. Therefore, if you want to understand intellectual life, you have to analyze the social relations of intellectual production, meaning the entire material system of intellectual production, as well as distribution and consumption, that formats, trains these subjects who then produce the products that are fetishized by the bourgeois humanities. And in doing that, then you shift from a kind of individualist approach that is beholden to bourgeois ideology to a more social analysis of the material forces that are driving the historical development of ideas. And very importantly, you situate all of that within class struggle, and very specifically global class struggle. So not only within an individual nation state, or you don't succumb to the kind of parochialism that dominates a lot of US American discourses. But coupled with that, and this is maybe the last thing I'd say, because we could talk for hours, of course, about just this one methodological point, is that it's not just historical materialism, it's also dialectical. And I, in being trained in Western Marxism and French theory, actually was turned off very early on to the term dialectics because it struck me as a kind of cheeky rhetorical device that authors would use either to avoid answering a question in a straightforward manner or to appear so sophisticated that they could occupy any position and its opposite over time. And so it was a kind of dialectics that would spin freeform, unmoored from material reality. It was an idealist version of dialectics, or what Lenin refers to as dialectics as a toy rattle, right? You just kind of play with it and it would be fun. Dialectics needs to be materialist because dialectics is, among many other things, the attempt on the part of human beings to develop the most rigorous account of the multifaceted complexity of the material world while that world is changing and while their agency itself is changing that world. So you need an account of the subjective-objective relationship as well as the temporal dimension over time. And so one of the things I insist on in the book is that I'm not simply identifying, Adorno, Marcuse, or these other figures like someone would take a dead butterfly and pin it to a board and say, this is what they were doing. No, I follow out their trajectory. I situate subjects within the objective social world, and I recount their trajectory, the forces operative within it, and the decisions they were making. So it's not a question of freedom versus determinism or the individual versus society. It is a dialectical analysis of how subjects are situated in an objective material world that conditions how they act, but within which they have their own agency. And ultimately, maybe coming full circle, the real objective of the book is for us to maximize our agency, to recognize the material forces that have tried to take from people the most important weapon of class struggle and co-opt it, pervert it, make it into a travesty, so that we, as the working class globally, do not have access to a tool that can actually fight and win against empire.
Yeah, that is a great summary of the methodology of this book. And you open the book with a pretty gruesome sort of and macabre story of the CIA, like literally as a headhunting organization going after the head of Che Guevara. And he, it's not just his head, like physically the acquisition of his head, but it's also the thoughts that are contained within it, that are revolutionary, that are inspiring, the many Vietnams that he had promised. And that was sort of the boogeyman of the CIA and, Western capitalism, et cetera. That was, literally in the back door or, in the backyard of the United States, in places like Bolivia or Latin America, or, 90 miles off the coast of the United States in a place called Cuba. I also, I want to put a pin in Heidegger, because as you were talking, like Heidegger, he's like the person who comes up always in my mind when it's like, when people talk about you have to separate the man and the man from his thoughts, right? And I have a philosopher friend, and he's always like, when I read his writing, I'm just like, I'm almost pulling my hair out, because I'm like, why don't you just go after who this man was? Like, what sort of social forces brought him into being? What was he representing? But they're not really allowed to sort of ask those questions. And even in, the theory realm, there is also that separation. But before we get into that conversation, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this question of dialectical historical materialism, and looking at how the natural sciences rigorously use something that we know as the scientific method. And I'd like you to maybe flesh that out a little bit more, because in the social sciences or in the humanities, there's an eschewing of a scientific sort of method, the rigor of using empirical facts to back up one's argument. And this is in your assessment part of a symptom of what you're trying to get at, to say that these thoughts don't just sit unmoored from social reality, but are actually structured, determined, cultivated, propagated by them.
Yeah, I mean, there was also within the book itself a defense of Marxism as a science, but I clarify what I mean by that. A lot of the kind of postmodern theory that became prevalent in the Anglosphere in the 80s and following went after the claim that one could presume to know or have totalizing knowledge or other such things. And they created a straw person out of the position that Marx and Marxists actually take, which is not that we can, as individual subjects, just apprehend the true nature of the world for all time and establish a blueprint, predict the future, all of these kind of laughable images of human knowledge that are projected onto the Marxists. Which is not to say that there aren't people, Marxism is a pretty broad category, and there are likely people who do pursue that type of project, but it's not at all what I'm talking about. And it's not at all what is essential to the core of the Marxist orientation that I'm uplifting and trying to as well move forward in various ways. Because just as I was saying a moment ago concerning the dialectical approach, any knowledge that's produced by subjects is produced by subjects who've been conditioned by an objective world. And so in that regard, there is a primacy of the objective within the dialectical relationship between subjectivity and objectivity. We need to recognize that the natural world was there before Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens are an outgrowth of it. And we are subjects who are reflecting back on and attempting to gain agency over this broader objective world. And one of the best ways of doing that is establishing very coherent collective procedures of verification that themselves are falsifiable so that they can be improved over time, so that knowledge isn't simply dependent on arguments from authority or trafficking in superstition or many other kind of epistemological mechanisms operative in particular bourgeois sciences or social sciences and humanities, but instead becomes something that we can rely on as a collective touchstone, right? So you mentioned the fact that there's a lot of footnotes. There's actually a lot fewer than I would have liked because I avoided, just referencing for referencing sake. But I did want to make sure that any claim that I made, another researcher such as yourself could follow that out, could read the sources. And if Nick, for instance, you read one of the chapters and you think, well, this doesn't sound quite right, and you read all of the footnotes and all the material that I drew on, and you propose a better explanatory framework for the extant evidence, I would not only be the first person to read it, but I would be the first person to admit that I was wrong if the explanatory framework that you propose is better and captures the facts better than mine does, right? So the process of science isn't establishing once and for all the objective nature of reality. It's an ongoing process of collective learning by which human beings try to establish the best explanatory framework, and the ultimate proof for the reliability of that framework is the primacy of practice. Does it cash out? Does it play out when we actually apply these ideas or these frameworks to practical reality? Which of course is one of the ultimate objectives of the book. And one of the reasons that I wanted to open it with the story of Che is not only to demonstrate that the war of ideas is much deeper and much more vicious than most people are aware, right? They didn't only kill Che, they wanted to seize his literary legacy and take ownership over the revolutionary ideas that the man represented. There's many documents from the Psychological Strategy Board that I didn't reference directly in the book or include in the appendix, which is only a tiny, tiny portion of the hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that I've been through. But they say regularly, the pen is mightier than the sword. The war of ideas is more important than the military war. It is the most important war because it's the war for hearts and minds. And if we win that war, we can win so many other wars. That was one of the reasons I wanted to start with the story of Che Guevara, because it frames the whole trilogy of the intellectual world war, Marxism versus the imperial theory industry. But the other reason, and the primary one that I was thinking of, is that one of the things that Che, I think, really manifests is the ongoing struggle to articulate theoretical frameworks nested within a practical reality and push the envelope. And so Che, Fidel, and the Cuban revolutionaries brought to the Western Hemisphere a version of revolutionary socialism that up to that point in time, for the most part, the empire had succeeded in banishing from the Western Empire. And 1959, there are plenty of other events and moments from the Haitian Revolution to the Mexican Revolution. I'm not trying to denigrate any of the rich revolutionary history, but 59 was a watershed moment nonetheless. And it was a watershed moment because it demonstrated also very significant advances, both theoretically and practically, in how it is that we organize to fight and win against empire. And so part of this project too is, when I was first exposed to more rigorous classical or orthodox versions of Marxism, there were always red flags that came with it saying, oh, watch out, it's very reductivist, it's determinist, it's old school, etc. And in coming to actually know this tradition deeply from the inside, I recognized that actually it's a tradition that is saturated with innovation, that regularly praises creativity, that embraces the need for the learning process of subjects to go on and on and on, because the objective situations keep changing and subjects have to learn. And what socialists are doing in the real world is they're charting uncharted territory. There's no blueprint, there's no Bible in Marx. It is us as human beings who are tasked with the most difficult thing imaginable, which is defeating imperialism before it defeats all of us and wipes out the planet and the biosphere.
Yeah, that's a very good summary of the stakes involved in this kind of work. And I think that's the other part of it too, is that there's this tendency to even say that there are no consequences to this kind of theoretical tradition, the one that sort of abdicates revolution and chastises and criticizes actually existing socialist projects, or grounds itself solely within the sort of Western epistemological framework that is only wedded to this idea of of Marxism as it's produced by the West, right? And I think there's a lot of different ways we can go with that, but I want to continue kind of to work our way through the book a little bit and thinking about how there are many different organizations and institutions that are working hand in hand to produce this. And I don't have the actual quote in front of me, but somewhere along the lines you say that it's not necessarily the CIA is like funding individuals who are puppets of this, but they're more so creating the sort of the stage for those puppets to be on, and it's a constellation of forces. Obviously there's the private foundations that are working hand in hand with the CIA and its objectives. There's also the CIA itself, but then there's the sort of public apparatus of the institutions themselves, the universities that are turning this out and creating the tenure processes. So maybe walk us through each of these sort of characters or these institutions, specifically with the foundations, because really, especially in this day and age, if you're not in with the foundation as it's kind of an expectation, not just within like biomedical research. A lot of what they get is like soft money from, it could be from NIH. Well, it used to be from NIH. No, it's no longer from NIH, but it's like sometimes with a pharmaceutical company, some kind of philanthropic research-oriented organization. But that's also the case it has been the case with the humanities in many ways. And these philanthropic organizations do determine the direction of research, not because they say, we're going to censor this. It just means that we're not going to fund it, and we're going to fund this, and this is going to proliferate, and because this is carrying the message that we want. So maybe walk us through some concrete examples of what that looks like. I think it's called the Big Three, and how that's identified by the CIA. And there's so much overlap between those foundations and the intelligence agency.
Thank you so much for this question, because unfortunately, as I think we've both seen, there are some uninformed hot takes by people who haven't read the book, and they're rolling out the anticipated slander scheme, which is that this is a conspiratorial book that says that there's a few intellectual puppets on strings who are controlled by people in the CIA with briefcases full of cash. And if anyone actually reads the book, before embarrassing themselves online, then they'll find out that the entire book argues primarily against this type of facile reductivism, because this is based on liberal ideology. The idea that there's free intellectuals who just exist, I guess, in some type of vacuum, and then there would be determined big, bad, nefarious state structures that would force them to do certain things or buy them off to do certain things. This is not at all how this system works. Now, that's not to deny that in certain instances, there are kind of direct relationships like this. But what the book maps out in some detail is the material system that I identify at one point as the military industrial academic complex. So intellectuals don't work in a vacuum. They work in the academy for the most part, or at least historically, that's been where many of them have been housed, at least academic intellectuals. And the academy is not an ivory tower. It is a pole of power that is situated within this broader complex of the military industrial academic complex, military indexing state power, industrial indexing capital power. So it's Washington, Wall Street, and the university, if you will, which ultimately is just one complex in a much larger complex that is the kind of financial state intellectual complex, which includes journalists, pundits, influencers, and other such things. But within that material system, what you have is a series of, at the simplest level, rewards and punishments that are allocated to those subjects who are operating within the system. So if you're an intellectual and you want to get a job or get invited to a junket or get published or get translated, you have to give to that system at some level what it demands of you. And there are different levels of compromise, there are different ways of navigating it, et cetera. And so this is not a critique of guilt by association, such that, well, somebody received a Ford grant, therefore we should tar and feather them in the local square. It's on the contrary, pointing out the kind of systemic nature of how the military industrial complex as an objective material system operates, and how certain subjects have navigated within that system to receive uplift from it, meaning promotion, preference, public visibility. And they have, in return for that, received a whole series of rewards that are both economic and symbolic. Symbolic in the sense that they've been promoted as the most important thinkers. They've been given enormous platforms, flown around the world to various junkets and whatnot. And so it's that system that needs to be understood. I say kind of in passing at one point that it's not puppets on strings. They control the marionette theater and they allow the puppets to come of their own free accord. So there's agency on the part of subjects who, for the most part, act as opportunists who want to be elevated within the system. And there's the system that governs that. So all of this leaves an enormous margin of maneuver for how people actually navigate the system. So the real story of the book, if you will, is how the most prominent figures of the Western so-called left intelligentsia have risen to prominence through various and sundry connections and differing degrees of collaboration with state forces and the forces of the capitalist ruling class, largely mediated by the foundations. And that rise to prominence has gone hand in hand with the most important political positions that they've taken, which are not just internecine academic debates. The most important issue for the state and for the capitalist ruling class is, where do people stand on global class struggle? Do they obscure imperialism, or do they recognize it as a material reality? And what do they make of the most successful fights against imperialism, which historically have been socialist state building projects? And that is how people are situated within this. And if you go across the archive as I have, it's remarkable how few intellectuals you find who maintain an anti-imperialist position in which they support actually existing socialism, not blindly, not idiotically, with, levels of critical reflection and a recognition that projects are ongoing, change over time, all of that. How few of them have actually been promoted to the level of the Western Marxists, the French theorists, or contemporary radical theorists, if it be Afro-pessimists, liberal queer theorists, or others of their ilk. And so all of that, I think, gives us a different account of the way we need to understand what liberals, and for that matter, many who are just infected by liberal ideology, refer to as the meritocracy or the marketplace of ideas. The most prominent ideas under empire are the ideas that serve directly or indirectly the interests of empire, which of course is perfectly in line with the work that Marx and Engels already laid out in the German ideology, to take one example among many others, where the ruling ideas of a given society are the ideas of its ruling class. Because, and this kind of brings us back to the earlier methodological discussion, if you have a historical and dialectical materialist approach to ideas, then you recognize that the material systems of knowledge production, the political economy of knowledge production, is really driving it. Now, there's one thing that I left out, and that is the foundations, and we could get into greater detail. I mean, kind of implicitly referred to them in this triangle of the military, industrial, academic complex. But what the foundations do is they're a form of twice stolen wealth. So you have corporations that exploit the working class and steal their wealth. But then instead of cycling this back, at least in principle, to the general public through systems of taxation in which that wealth could be used by the government, again, at least in principle, for things like highways, sewers, or other things that would be public services, they retain that wealth by parking it in their foundations because it's a tax write-off, and then they use that foundation wealth to engage in soft power interventions in the intellectual sphere, in the media sphere, in every sphere imaginable. That basic mechanism of foundations is one of the most important aspects of US imperial style domination, and they work hand in glove with the US national security state. I chart this out in the book, but if you look at the leadership of the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, which were the biggest ones in the early Cold War, they not only have a liaison directly to the Central Intelligence Agency, but they co-fund many of the same projects. So the idea, the very liberal idea that you'd have the private sphere of foundations and then you'd have the public sphere of government, is really just trying to obscure the fact that these are deeply, deeply nested within one another. And what the foundations have historically supported is the type of work that goes in the direction that they want to go in. Now, there are contradictions, right? There are people who have accepted a Ford grant or a Rockefeller grant, but as you say, very importantly, Nick, they're the people who are not going to be refunded. Now, in the case of the Western Marxists that I look at in this book very specifically, the Frankfurt School, you cannot understand their history unless you actually investigate the Rockefeller connection and the US national security state connection. There were 7 members of the Frankfurt School who worked for a combined total of more than 50 years for the US state. They also worked very closely with the Rockefellers, who supported them with individual grants and collective grants over time. And so you have a level of, connection to Wall Street and Washington that is deeply permeates their entire history. I'll just point to one example as a kind of teaser to encourage people to check out the details. The Rockefellers ran the Marxism-Leninism project during the Cold War, in which they funded, to the tune of, in 2025 dollars, millions of dollars, a global architecture of institutions, intellectuals, doctoral students, and publications, translations that were all aimed at studying critically Marxism-Leninism and promoting, they don't say this as, they don't use this terminology, but it's obvious if you read through all of the documents, promoting Western Marxism, or what they call authentic Marxism, trying to show that the ideas of Marx were authentic and that everything that exists in the real world based on the ideas of Marx has been a complete travesty and should be condemned. The point person for that project intellectually was Herbert Marcuse. And he worked with Philip Mosley, who was a high-level, long-standing Central Intelligence Agency consultant who had his hand in a whole series of operations, including the Russian Institute that he was the director of, but then also a number of other projects that I outline in the book. So one of the other elements, and I'll leave it at this because otherwise I'll go on at too much length, is that I really want to bring to the fore in the book how the bourgeois state actually works. So there's a theory of the bourgeois state, if you will. It's not my own personal theory. It's based on a materialist analysis and drawing on the best dialectical and historical materialist analyses of the bourgeois state. The bourgeois state operates in terms of dual governance. It has a political theater that it puts on, and then it has an invisible level of government that's not beholden to democratic, any type of democratic oversight. I mean, the political theater barely is anyway. And this is the segment of government that really tends to make sure that capital rules by any means necessary. And therefore, the interventions into the kind of cultural and intellectual sphere are part and parcel of what the state is tasked with doing. It needs to keep the kind of bourgeois cultural apparatus going in the direction that it needs to go in, and will intervene in it when it's not, and make sure that it does.
Yeah, that you hit a lot of my questions on my on my sheet here. But I'm going to try to get to all of them. But as you were talking, I was just thinking about the recent news of, and this isn't a Western Marxist, but nonetheless, somebody who is positioned as a radical intellectual critic of U.S. empire. But Noam Chomsky's, the revelations of Noam Chomsky and in the Epstein files, standing with Steve Bannon, who is, the sort of Trump arm propagandist, but then also just having this long-standing relationship with, Epstein. And there's a lot to unpack there, but I think, without looking at, like, it's not just about like Chomsky's individual choices, even though I do think that there's there has to be some sort of comment there. And it's not like, I know, he may not be physically able to respond now, but he could have, several years ago, when this came out, when it was known. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it shows that there is this kind of milieu of people who are interacting with each other, and it's not just Epstein. Like, it's all the other people who are in this orbit, right? Trump is in this orbit. Steve Bannon is in this orbit. Bill Clinton, some of the most powerful, dynasties in the history of the world are in this orbit. I don't have access. I just simply don't have access to that. Like, we are not the same kind of intellectual. And I think that's important to point out to people. It's not, I think there's this, we're granting a lot of leeway to an individual who's supposed to, not just, again, like, let's not just talk about Chomsky. Let's talk about, this intellectual class as a whole, because you have people like Steven Pinker, Larry Summers, the list goes on and on and on. And that's just the Epstein connection. There are other, I think, more nefarious, connections that I think, like you draw out in the book, like, James Scott being, working for the Central Intelligence Agency, the anarchist Yale professor who I had to read in and out, cover to cover, to pass my exams, to understand the main trends in historiography at the moment, who at the time I actually questioned because I didn't understand. I was like, what's the overall project? You just hate states. All states aren't the same. Like, that was my base level critique at the time. But I remember sitting with a group of scholars at lunch, and we were discussing, or at a dinner, and we were discussing this. And one of his colleagues got extremely offended when I began to just say, well, he admitted to his connections to the CIA. And I just read, it was like, I think I had just read Vincent Bevan's book, The Jakarta Method. And it was like, there's some like serious consequences to these kinds of things. It wasn't just like, a boyish impulse of like, I'm, an intelligence asset to the CIA. A lot of the people he was surveilling probably ended up killed. And he probably knew that they had ended up killed. I can't say in my personal experience, like, I share that kind of level of complicity in a certain project, right? And so I think it's important to kind of point that out, but it's also important to point out that this is a very, as you're saying, it's a very structural phenomenon. And it's not just whether one is like, has the black bag in hand of cash that they're getting from, the trench coat, the trench coated figure on the corner. It's not as, and I say this because I've been reading in my next project, I've been reading a lot of surveillance files and police files on the American Indian movement, but it's kind of shifted to other sort of social movements. But one thing the FBI was obsessed with, and I haven't really seen this written about, but it was obsessed with how the story of the FBI was going to be told about this particular moment in time. Definitely. So what did it do? It wrote op-eds in the local newspaper. And then one of its informants went out and began working on a book to publish that was based on informant interviews that this individual had collected. And and then there was a CIA operative who was involved, and he was going to Nicaragua, he was spying on the Sandinistas. This is not a, it sounds conspiratorial, but it's actually the documentation
So
is
clear.
all there, and people propagate these ideas, perhaps some unknowingly. I think you call it like concentric rings, or so to speak, where you have these intelligence agencies at the center, and then you sort of have concentric rings of association. And I would say we're really far on the outside. Nonetheless, we're operating in their world. We can't deny that, but at the same time, there are like sort of levels of influence, and as you kind of get closer to the sources, you do see those more explicit connections. But I think it's more of a structural sort of background that I think you're talking about. Again, like, I think I did see some of those critiques of your book about like, there's this back, and it's like, well, there were actually some people who were just getting the black bag of cash, but
Yeah.
I think in general, you're talking about this kind of constellation, this array of forces that is really driving. If you think about it like a factory, is driving this product, which is a commodity. It's theory. It's the theory industry that is producing this, and it does have consequences. It does have consequences in the way that research is conducted, whether research is funded at all, or whether research happens at all, and how publication happens, because there's also associations with the publishing industry. So sorry, that's a lot to kind of chew on, but I was just thinking as you were talking, what's happening in the news. I think there's kind of a sensational aspect to it, but also it's there in the archival record, and you're sort of mapping it out. It's not conspiratorial. And I think I think you even addressed that in your book. There's sort of this dismissal of even doing this kind of research as a sort of conspiracy theory.
There is a section, because a level of involvement of the US state in the cultural apparatus, so the entire system of cultural production, dissemination, and consumption, boggles the imagination. I mean, they're involved in, the FBI was directly involved in the FBI TV series that was running for years. They've been involved in a ton of films. They really do sculpt an image of themselves and of empire that serves their interests. In fact, one of my future projects is on the empire of spectacles and the specific way in which the US, as it emerged as the leading imperialist power in the wake of World War II, had to try to develop an empire that looked democratic. It looked anti-fascist. It even looked somewhat anti-colonial because of the just massive anti-colonial, anti-fascist wave that continued after World War II. And in order to do that, they had to create an empire under cover of the spectacle. And that's a very, very important part of all of what we're talking about. And there are sections in the book where I go into the level of media penetration. It's not just that they have a few journalists, they own journalistic platforms. They have taken control over a whole series of networks for the service news outlets. So basically the news that comes out through AP, Reuters, and things like this. So basically you get it at the root, right? Prior to then it being interpreted by various journalists. And anyway, there's a lot on that in the book, because the goal isn't just to diagnose and kind of criticize Western Marxism, but to situate it ultimately within the larger imperial system of disinformation. And it is significant what is happening now with Chomsky and the Epstein files and whatnot. It's clear that Epstein he was deeply, deeply involved in the intelligence networks. And if you know the history of the CIA and FBI, one of the things that they've done is they always want to be able to create communities that they control. And so having dirt on all of their collaborators was essential. And they do this through drugs, through sex, through prostitution. And I hope that the Epstein films will come out. I'm uncertain if they will, due to the fact that there are ruling class interests in prohibiting that. It actually wasn't surprising to me that Chomsky was in this network because of a number of things. Chomsky is someone who has done some significant work diagnosing US imperialism from a very specific vantage point of anarcho-syndicalism, in which he does not proffer a positive solution outside of criticizing imperialism and pointing out its hypocrisy. right? The reason that the empire is not going to overcome its hypocrisy is because there are material forces driving the empire that will not allow it to massage that contradiction away. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an empire, meaning that there's not an analysis in Chomsky of there's not a dialectical and historical materialist analysis of the bourgeois state. And so it really deprives us of a much deeper understanding. And he also has been one of the most outspoken anti-communists. I'll just share one of my choice quotes with you. Chomsky claimed Leninism was, in my view, counter-revolutionary. It wasn't instituting communism. There was a popular revolution. Lenin basically tried to take control of it. If you take a look at his writings from 1917, they went way to the left. And then he goes on to say that ultimately Lenin was a counter-revolutionary, right? This is a remarkable position to take that has nothing whatsoever to do with a historical record. And it happens to be perfectly in line with all of the internal documents that I've read that go after Marxism, Leninism as the principal enemy of the bourgeois state. And he also, if you're familiar with the scandal around the work of Gilbert Ashkar, who had done work for the British Ministry of Defense and was paid apparently hundreds of thousands of pounds for cultural advice on how to operate in former colonies. And then when questioned about this, he said that it was Chomsky who recommended that he do this on the, based on the idea that, well, we should get our quote unquote lefty ideas into all spaces, including like imperialist spaces, military spaces, etc. And he claimed that Chomsky also gave a lecture at the US military's West Point Academy in 2006. And that's one of the reasons that he was inspired to work directly with the British Ministry of Defense. And so, and there's also all of the MIT connections. MIT is, largely a government cutout. It's doing a lot of governmental work. And so none of this is to say, and actually it brings us back to an important point in the book, I advocate for a dialectical analysis, and I draw very strongly on Marx, Engels, and Lenin, who said that bourgeois culture is the most developed form of culture, and developed simply in the sense that it has had access to the greatest material resources for developing itself. Therefore, it would be shocking if there weren't some things of value within bourgeois culture, including intellectual culture. We should learn anything that we can from them. But at the same time, our critique should be able to identify how particular positions, intellectual or cultural, that are taken within that are ultimately compromised because they limit the scope of their critique and they do not give us a positive solution to the problems that they point out. And so it would, I think be a very poor position to take to say something like, well, we shouldn't read any of these authors, or we should just ignore them, or they were all compromised. We should recognize them for what they are and were, and that is intellectuals who might be very smart people, but were also working with the interests of empire in various ways, advancing their personal agenda, and the concentric circles is really important. Some of them, Sidney Hook and James Burnham, they were moonlighting for the CIA, and they were big name philosophy professors at NYU. Gloria Steinem was proud of and bragged about working with the CIA. But then you go out and out and out in these other concentric circles and you identify how people are situated. This is what a dialectical analysis is. It's far from reductivism. It's far from the kind of simplistic hot takes that you get. You actually do the serious work of studying the archive and trying to situate people within that overall kind of force field, if you will, of relations. And the fact that Chomsky's compromised really doesn't surprise me one bit. And I think it would be very good for people to be clued into the shadow that someone like Chomsky cast over an intellectual who was, largely a contemporary, Michael Parenti, who never secured a full-time academic post, was regularly criticized by the mainstream media, deplatformed in numerous ways. I have never read any of his work in the academy. I never see it cited within academic work, but is arguably one of the single most important intellectuals of the latter part of the 20th and early 21st century. And so if you line up Michael Parenti and Noam Chomsky, and you look at the work that they've done in analyzing the media, in diagnosing politics, in understanding empire, and studying the history of actually existing socialism, it's like, comparison between a complete titan who was cutting against the grain of empire, had the highest level of integrity, suffered enormously at a personal level due to that, but was pushing forward a project that has educated so many of us, and we have an enormous debt to him, versus someone who was celebrated by the New York Times as being the most important living intellectual. And the New York Times did that for a reason. So all of that, I think, needs to be understood as this kind of a bigger kind of complex. And last thing that I'll say is that I think there's going to be more that comes out about the Chomsky affair, and we'll just have to kind of follow it diligently, critically, and without kind of overstating the case, but also identifying why it is that he has been such a prominent intellectual within the empire.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to assess the situation. For myself, I read Chomsky, and his work was the first to introduce me in high school to Palestine. And I get, and I remember the Fateful Triangle. I remember reading that and like being very influenced by it. But I also, as I got older and as these revelations kind of came out, I wasn't actually like shocked or surprised, and it also didn't I wasn't like dumping all my Chomsky books on, off the shelf. It was just like, it made sense. I was like, well, that makes sense. Well, I read Black Shirts in Red by Michael Parenti, and that was one of the best, most influential books I've ever read in my life. It totally set me down, and I recommend it to everyone because it's like, it's pamphlet size. You can read it in a day, or you can read it in an afternoon if you're really ambitious.
Get off the live stream now and read it, right? Like, it's gonna be the best thing you've ever read. Absolutely.
But it just lays out such a great case for the Communist Project, and looking at it from the long view of history and the backlash. And I think that's what we kind of get away from in the academy. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on critique. There's a lot of emphasis on novelty. And as the older I get, the more like conservative I get, not conservative like political context, but methodologically, and to say like, this is still a tried and true method of historical inquiry. We're, Sina and I are rereading Marx's Capital Volume 1, and reading it outside of the context of the university is so liberating and so illuminating for me, and like so educational and fun, and like I've it's changed how I've done my own work. Like I'm like slowing down a little bit more, being more careful, like really examining the sources that I'm using. I think what you bring up about sources, if you read Marx, Engels, Lenin, any of the great thinkers in the Marxist tradition, they're all citing liberal, bourgeois intellectuals, scholars, and things like that. They're not, if you read, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, it's like 99% like liberal bourgeois scholars, with the recognition that he's advancing a different kind of project, right? And but he needs them to kind of make those arguments. And so I think what you is we're doing different things for different outcome and a different sort of political project. And let's move on, because I feel like we have to get into. I mentioned I wanted to talk about Heidegger, but I feel like even in graduate school, I took a class outside of my discipline at the time, and they were teaching Heidegger, and I was kind of like shocked because I knew, like, just at a base level, he was a Nazi, but the way that he was being presented in the class was similar to the way that you encounter him in the book, at least his defenders. And I didn't actually know that he was the instructor for so many of the prominent sort of like French theorists and critical theorists who went on to really make a mark in the field. And so maybe you can situate Heidegger within the context of this book. I know he's just one figure amongst many, but then also if you can maybe look at Heidegger and then move on to the Frankfurt School and thinking about the sort of lasting impact of that institute on what we know as critical theory.
I'd say, just to start with, that I want to applaud your willingness and desire to slow down, work through sources, take things seriously. The scientific method we were talking about earlier is also something you have to apply personally. And there's lots of pressure within the academy, and the digital culture arguably just makes it worse, where you see a tweet and you think you know something. You really, really have to be serious about doing scholarship to advance the collective project of science. So that's just a methodological side note. But Heidegger famously claimed that the only thing of interest in the personality of a philosopher is he was born then and then, he worked, and he died. And this statement is often fetishized as having been a kind of, great insight into the way in which we should do philosophy, which is you don't analyze someone's life, you don't analyze their practice, you don't situate them within material relations. All you do is you study their ideas. And it's very unfortunate that some people who have been exposed to my work just parrot bourgeois ideology instead of thinking twice about how it is that they've been trained. So it's a very unoriginal point to say, Rockhill doesn't deal with the philosopher's ideas. He simply talks about their context. Well, actually, I do both. And I do both because I'm critical of the methodologies of both the bourgeois humanities, which engages in intellectual commodity fetishism, and the bourgeois social sciences. And this resonates with the earlier methodological conversation that we had. Now, one of the reasons that Heidegger maintained this position is also because he was not only a Nazi, he was an unrepentant Nazi, right? He actually refused to apologize publicly in any way, shape, or form. He also identified National Socialism as, quote, what he expected to, quote, be a deliverance of Western Dasein, Western existence, from the dangers of communism. So the reason he was a Nazi is because he was an anti-communist. And the anti-communism, of course, continued. Now, one of the reasons that Heidegger is an important kind of reference point, if you will, is because of the unbelievable influence that he's had on the history of 20th century thought, so much so that some people say that he's the most important thinker of the 20th century. Forgetting Lenin, forgetting Parenti, forgetting many other figures one could point to, Walter Rodney, etc. But Heidegger was really significant in influencing both the Western Marxism of the Frankfurt School and French theory, because what both of these schools of thought, broadly construed, were attempting to do was to develop a philosophy that could rival dialectical and historical materialism. This is precisely what the Rockefellers were funding. It's what the Fords wanted. It's also what the US national security state wanted. They recognized that they couldn't outright defeat Marxism, so they needed to shore up some version of, faux Marxism and radical theory that could be a rallying point for people that would provide something akin to a kind of doctrine or framework that was opposed to dialectical and historical materialism. And in fact, the Rockefellers' Marxism-Leninism project originally began with seed money that was given to a professor who was working, actually two professors, including one who's a complete reactionary, to do work on existentialism and phenomenology as a potential rival philosophy. And of course, existentialism and phenomenology are identified very strongly with the work of Heidegger and a number of other figures. And so Heidegger functions as a kind of important rallying point for, in particular, post-war intellectuals who wanted to appear to be on the left, but were ultimately waging an intellectual world war against Marxism of the anti-imperialist sort. He was very impactful on the work of Marcuse, on Habermas's work as well. Both of them have their criticisms of Heidegger and don't follow him directly down the kind of pro-Nazi path. But there's a proximity that makes it such that you have to situate their political positions within a kind of broader spectrum, and you don't just say, oh, well, they were critical of him for being a Nazi, therefore their politics were great. On the contrary, I go into some detail about the positions that Marcuse and Habermas have taken over time that are highly problematic, to say the least. And the other role that Heidegger played that is very significant is within the French theoretical world, the generation of thinkers that were identified as the structuralists and later post-structuralists within the Anglosphere Derrida, Foucault, and people like this. They're born in the 20s and 30s. They're of the same generation as Samir Amin or Roberto Fernandez Retamar, the great Cuban intellectual. But what they dedicated their lives to was waging a war against the dominant philosophy of the immediate post-war era, which was Marxism, that even Sartre and Beauvoir were, they were Western Marxists to some extent, but they were anti-imperialist to some degree, and they were fellow travelers, at least at certain points in time, to the French Communist Party. They were definitely, in a broadly construed Marxist camp. And to wage that war, what Foucault, Derrida, and many of these other figures did, Deleuze, of course, is they latched on to the Heideggerian tradition and the Nietzschean tradition. Nietzsche being a radical aristocrat whose philosophy was absolutely pitted against socialism and communism. And they tried to leverage Nietzsche and Heidegger as an alternative kind of philosophic tradition over and against the real tradition of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, and others. And so that story I get into much more deeply in the second volume of this study, because it focuses on French theory and how French theory is ultimately a kind of product of US American cultural imperialism, because it was funded, supported, and promoted internationally by the US. That's what actually made French theory, not just the French intellectual scene. But one of the reasons it was promoted is because they recognized that here we have an apparently novel, innovative, trendy, and radical, at least in appearance, philosophy that was pushing back directly against the Marxist tradition, while trying to shore up and push forward a tradition coming out of Nietzsche and Heidegger. And in that way, that tradition, they tried to make it into a kind of liberal left position to some extent. But I go into this in the second volume because it depends on who you're talking about, right? Foucault was actually, he flirted with Maoism in the wake of '68, largely as a branding campaign for himself and his kind of image as a radical. But otherwise, he was a virulent anti-communist. And one of his favorite personal jokes was that I'm a primary anti-communist, because when you're a secondary anti-communist, it's too late. And this was a joke that he would regularly repeat to friends, and is recounted in Didier Eribon's biography on him, who was also a friend of Foucault's. So, it depends on the particular figure. And of course, I'm always in favor of a nuanced analysis, and that's what I put forth. But in general, you see French theory as being Nietzschean, Heideggerian, and anti-Marxist. And that's one of the things that people have to identify, is it's actually part of the broader kind of intellectual Cold War dynamic that people are trying to invisibilize by saying that, well, we as philosophers, meaning we as intellectuals who want to give up on thinking the world and simply follow the paths that are outlined by the academy. That's what that statement is saying. We think that we can't analyze the broader world. We only have to read it in terms of these intellectual lineages and kind of isolated figures. So it's reductivist in the sense of it's reducing the broader world to atomized intellectuals and their purported intellectual contributions. And Heidegger has had both intellectually and kind of historically, if you will, an outsized importance in that regard.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating because Marxism is often castigated as something that is class reductionist. Yeah. It's reducing things to, there's also this accusation of unreconstructed Marxist. What is that supposed to be? I don't know. I think it's like, I think it actually means in the context of what you just laid out in this book, that you didn't accept or internalize the reforms to the Marxist tradition to make it more palatable to the bourgeoisie and the ruling class. That's what listening to this, it's like, okay, that's what being an unreconstructed Marxist means. That you have to be reconstructed to be safe and only operate within the sort of intellectual genealogical traditions. And God forbid you take what you learn in the page out into the street.
Exactly.
The next question is just like situating, you have several chapters on Horkheimer and Adorno. And, I again, these are individuals that I had to read in graduate school, and Adorno was just like I could not actually read him. Partly, I think that was just because the translations that existed were so bad, but also I think that he was kind of obscurantist in many ways. But these two figures, play a very important role within the Frankfurt School. But you already spoke a little bit about the origins of the Frankfurt School and its proliferation, but maybe talk about the influence of these two figures specifically in your thesis, and why they're so important in what later becomes, or what they are actually fashioning as the theory industry.
They really play a foundational role in shoring up Western Marxism as a version of Marxism that is Marxist in theory and anti-communist in practice. And the prominence that they've had within the broader theory industry has meant that if you are serious about engaging as an intellectual, even anywhere in the world due to intellectual imperialism, and particularly if you identify to some extent with the Marxist tradition, then you have to read them. And in fact, you have to read everything they wrote and all the secondary and tertiary literature on them. Otherwise, you couldn't possibly begin to formulate a critique because of their level of sophistication and nuance. And the impact that I think that they've had is that people have tended to, and it's not just them, right? There are many other forces that are contributing to this, including what is referred to as the kind of second and third generation of Frankfurt School critical theory. So Habermas, and then you have contemporary figures today, Axel Honneth, Nancy Fraser, and others, is that they have a kind of version of Marxian analysis that gives up on a broader investigation into both the natural world, meaning the scientific project, and political economy. They don't center the primary contradiction of imperialism, and they are all critics of actually existing socialism. So much so that in the case of Horkheimer and Adorno, they openly supported imperialist projects. Horkheimer thought that the war in Vietnam should be supported. He and Adorno both supported the imperialist intervention in the Suez Crisis. They referred to Nasser as a fascist chieftain who was allying with Moscow. They also, very importantly, allied with fascists in post-war Germany and integrated them directly into the Frankfurt School. This, I don't think anyone has written about, but I discovered the extent to which, I shouldn't say that. There are a few German scholars who've written about it, and I don't think their work is translated, who've touched on these topics, but it's not widely known that the school that is touted for being one of the most important anti-fascist schools of thought actually worked directly with fascists and Nazis, including the longest serving director of the Institute for Social Research, who, as I point out in the book, spent more time being a Nazi than a former Nazi before he was actually began to be integrated into the Frankfurt School, and then later occupied positions of power within it. And so all of that, I think, sheds broader light on the orientation that this school has taken. And this also touches on one of the kind of threads throughout the book, because I have a parallel project that I've been working on for years that is an analysis of fascism in the 21st century, right? Drawing on the dialectical and historical materialist tradition, but also looking at how fascism has played itself out and taken on different forms, particularly during the reign of the US Imperium. And so throughout the course of the book, the issue of fascism keeps cropping up. And part of that is related to this other kind of parallel project, but it's also because of the ways in which Western Marxism has taken positions akin to liberalism, and that in taking those positions, it has basically aided and abetted the seedbed of fascism, which is capitalism, while fighting the principal enemy of fascism and the only way of really abolishing fascism, which is you need a socioeconomic transformation that leads to socialism. And in that way, when the student movement called the leaders of the Frankfurt School, supporters of fascism directly or indirectly, I think that they were not that far from things that people really have to take seriously.
Yeah, I think you have to have a really profound understanding or accurate understanding of not just World War II, but the post war moment, and understanding that the USSR played a central role in not only defeating fascism, but also preventing it from rising again in Europe, but then also
Yeah.
supporting national liberation movements throughout the world. But I would also kind of have a little bit of a caveat with that, because it wasn't just because the USSR was, like the United States, and just injecting, sort of a carte blanche, resources into places so that they could do their bidding. It was more so supporting organic anti-imperialist movements. And I think there was even this conversation. I was a friend of I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, Alex Lavinia, and we were talking about the the role that the USSR played in armed struggle in Latin America for left movements and socialist movements. And oftentimes, there was always this kind of accusation that they were, even Cuba was like it was a puppet regime of the USSR. And Castro was like later sort of interviewed by like a CNN documentary or something like that. And they asked him about that. And he's like, well, had that been the case, had there been more direct collaboration and planning with us, he's like, then we would have won the war.
Yeah.
I think there's kind of this idea that somehow there's parity, and you see this a lot with anti-Chinese sentiment today, in the sense that it's like, it's not just the U.S.'s surveillance empire. It's like the United States is mimicking China's surveillance empire. It's like, or like they're mimicking the surveillance of the Chinese Communist Party. They always have to orientalize it and add that sort of anti-communist twist to it. And I'll have some like concluding questions here, because we're kind of we're running up on time. But you talk a little bit about, or you not a little bit, you talk a lot about Herbert Marcuse, and maybe I'll let you kind of end the discussion that we're having on the book, because I have some questions that are kind of a little bit beyond the book, beyond the project itself, but nonetheless related. But maybe you want to wrap it up and just kind of say, like, why Herbert Marcuse, who was somebody who was also being surveilled himself. He's got quite an extensive FBI file. I think it's actually on the FBI vault. You can check it out there. But then also how he becomes also a very prominent figure in the sort of thesis that you're laying out, as somebody who is positioned as radical. And I've met many of his students. They commend him as somebody who had radicalized them during this time period, during this very tumultuous era. But he himself is like harboring many of the sort of reactionary sort of tendencies that you're talking about.
Yeah, I would say first off, just concerning your statements about the Soviet Union, that the struggle to build socialism in the world is also the struggle against colonialism and the struggle against fascism. Right. And that it's widely recognized across this tradition that these go hand in hand, right? The colonial question and the issue of fascism need to be understood as part and parcel of the exact same project. And that doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't contradictions and complications in the history of actually existing socialist states or their international relations. And there are many of them, including conflicts between revolutionary communist organizations in Latin America and the orientation that Moscow took, or the Sino-Soviet split. Like, it's a very complex history. But if you look at it at its largest kind of, or highest level of concrete abstraction, the war that's being waged is a war not only against capitalism, but against the fascistic colonial drive of fascism that has reduced the overwhelming majority of the peoples of this world to the slaves of empire, and the planet for that matter. But speaking more specifically to the final point that you raised concerning the book, Marcuse is a very complicated figure, and it's one of the reasons that the chapter on him is so long. And to put my cards on the table, I did not go into this project with a chip on my shoulder and the decision to, take Marcuse down a few notches. On the contrary, and the same is true of all of these other figures, I was trained in this work. Marcuse, I remember being very affected by, because I identified him as seemingly the most radical of the Frankfurt School. I remember the first time I read Essay on Liberation, I thought, wow, here's somebody who's really interested in applying these ideas. He takes a certain version of anti-imperialist, a certain version of anti-imperialism. He supported the women's liberation struggle. He supported the Black liberation struggle, the, various kind of new left movements, if you will. But in mining down into his history, I discovered a whole series of things in the archive that I simply didn't know and aren't part of the public discussion. There's a few things that have been written and some of the documents that have been published from his OSS days, but a lot of what I outline in the chapter is not part of at least public knowledge within the Anglosphere. There's some excellent, excellent scholarship in German that I draw on, and I recommend that people either read those books or help get them translated. But Marcuse was a very significant top-level specialist in communism in the State Department, who was working on a whole series of projects that were aimed at overthrowing actually existing socialism. And the idea that he was simply involved in an anti-fascist struggle when he was in the OSS really just elides a big part of his history. When he actually got his first academic appointments, they were at Central Intelligence Agency cutouts at Columbia and Harvard, and he was still a contracted worker at the State Department. So he was simultaneously State Department and a university professor, and he continued to work with and ally with the same fundamental network of former or current U.S. national security state operatives. Now, it is crystal clear that he was radicalized. He moved from a position of kind of anti-Soviet, anti-communism to a position that was funded by the Rockefellers, by the way, in One-Dimensional Man and works like this, where he was critical of certain forms of industrialization, one-dimensional society as he kind of outlines it, and instead proffered the great refusal, this kind of anarchist and largely individualist refusal of the system, but there wasn't really any solution that was outlined. But then with the anti-imperialist movements and the rise of the New Left, he clearly moves to the left himself. And I chart that out. And this is a very important part of the book, is it's not a matter of reducing an individual to a position and then saying, that's it. No, you have to chart out their overall kind of evolution. But what's also interesting in Marcuse's case is that the US national security state had problem on its hands with the rise of the New Left. On the one hand, the New Left was a very useful enemy because it hated the old left and was denigrating actually existing socialism, Communist Party organizing, state building projects, etc. And so they wanted to support it in doing that type of war. But on the other hand, as you alluded to in the FBI research that you've been doing and other intelligence agencies, with COINTELPRO, which is, of course, just one name for a very sprawling and very, very large set of projects, they wanted to absolutely destroy the New Left and eliminate it. And so in being caught within this contradiction, Marcuse has, I've read his entire FBI file. What is it? 600, 700, 800 pages. It's enormous, right? And they were keeping very clear tabs on him. And he was identified as dangerous for certain reasons. While at the same time, given the fact that he continued to work closely with a whole series of US national security state connections and intellectuals who were tied to the state in various ways, as well as tied to the Rockefellers and capitalist financial interests, he was an intellectual who ended up being the face of the even godfather, as people refer to him, of the New Left. And you have to ask yourself some questions about that. And these are the questions that I raise. Well, why wasn't George Jackson, promoted in this way? Why weren't some of the leaders of the American Indian movement promoted in this way? Why wasn't Che Guevara promoted in this way? Like, there are a lot of other figures who could be promoted and given an enormous platform, have films made about them, be interviewed on mainstream TV, endless articles written about them in mainstream news outlets that have direct connections to the US national security state. And I leave the question somewhat open-ended because I still think that there's more that we need to know about this case, but it's very, very possible that there was an interest in having a controlled opposition, meaning a figure who could, granted, take positions that were somewhat dangerous, but useful positions, because to the end of his day, and I chart this out in great detail, Marcuse remained an anti-communist. He remained a stalwart anti-communist who took positions. He has a final article, I believe it was the last article that he published. It's very long, that he kind of refers to as a retrospective article looking back on all of his work and drawing on the most important dissident who was supported by Western intelligence services, Rudolf Barrot, who was a German dissident who was from East Germany. And he wrote the work reflecting on Barrot's work, but then also using it to kind of provide a recapitulation of Marcuse's own position. And if you read through that essay, it's a structural inversion of some of the most fundamental points regarding Marxism, like the proletariat's not the revolutionary subject. The people who might be the driving force behind history are the movement of the marginals. So these people who are kind of have been left out of history in various ways, racialized subjects, women, etc., which of course are very important, but they're important as well because they're part of class struggle, not because they're this kind of identitarian or culturalist identification of them as being significant. He also really privileges idealist approaches. He supports a kind of anarchist orientation that ends up being anti-state. If he references the potential of Cuba or China, it's always as them being a potential for overcoming the limits of actually existing socialism in the Soviet sphere. And he claims that they're not actually socialist, you know, at various points in his corpus. So Marcuse is someone who I think needs to be worked through carefully, because he did take some positions, you know, that I think are worthy of support. And one of the problems, unfortunately, and I'll leave it at that, is that the type of work that we're talking about doing, which is scientific, which is rigorous, which takes its time, which dwells on and tarries with the complexities of individual positions and the complexities of material systems, many people don't want to be bothered. And they just want to say things like, oh, Rockhill just throws Marcuse under the bus. No, I'm really actually trying to contribute to a collective elucidation. I want other scholars to come forth and say, look, there are these elements of his trajectory. We can map this out in even greater detail. But what I bring to the fore is his complicity with empire is highly, highly problematic. So just maintaining him as a kind of golden calf and a lodestone is very, I think, unworthy of those who are interested in fighting against imperialism in a way that actually supports the types of projects that we need to wage that war in such a way that we win, instead of being either sidelined or being compromised due to ultimately a kind of accommodation to capitalism and imperialism.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna make a hot take here.
Okay,
but because I'm you know, working on this new project, and I'm reading a lot of the New Left historiography, and it's quite fascinating because, you know, like the Panthers, I think are, what I've read, they're really pushing back in many ways on the New Left. And I feel like the New Left, as it kind of defines itself, and, you know, historians have defined it as the movement of movements, meaning that it contained this sort of multiplicity, and, you know, you had all these, you know, various sort of, you know, power movements. I think even the using the umbrella term of the New Left for the power movements, Black Power, Red Power, Brown Power, Chicano Power, doesn't do justice to those movements, because I would say more often than not they diverged from the sort of overt kind of overtly led, student-led New Left movements that were explicitly anti-communist,
Right.
You know, very critical of actually existing socialism. And I think the historians of the New Left largely came from those movements to rewrite it and to include those, in some ways to also defang or to blunt that sort of sharp edge, right? Because like, even if you look at like George Jackson's Soledad Brother, like that was, they edited that so finely to like remove any kind of revolutionary speak that he had to go out and, you know, write and publish himself, Blood in Your Eye.
Right.
And which is a much more kind of clear, you know, a take on what's needed to achieve revolution in the United States. I mean, there's, you know, he was a man imprisoned and, you know, confined to a cell most of his time incarcerated, but excuse me, like a solitary confinement. So he was operating on limited knowledge, and so there are some, you know, flaws in his thinking, but nonetheless, that's the true version of George Jackson, which a lot of people might go and get a version of George Jackson, just like they might go and get a version of Che Guevara, and kind of see them as like maybe like idealistic revolutionaries, but not really. It's always offered through this kind of filtering lens, and that's what I appreciated about this book, because I was as I'm going through these archives right now, it's almost like an inoculation against kind of falling victim to some of these, to say like, well, the New Left included all the power movements, and this is what they all believed, and they were all critical of, Soviet communism, because that's literally what many New Left historians are saying.
Yeah.
Or they will say, this was a broad, COINTELPRO operation of this, and this, and in fact, if you actually read the FBI files, COINTELPRO like ended in 1971. It did some of the tactics continue? Obviously, they did, but it also transformed into something else. For the first time, the FBI was engaging in military firefights with activists. They had never done that before. It wasn't a transition. And so even the way, as we started off in the beginning of this interview, I was telling you about my investigations, and the FBI was very much interested in narrating the story of itself as one of being reformed in its most violent period, in the reign of terror it waged against the American Indian movement. That was not a COINTELPRO operation. Historians have written, as New Left historians has written, as if it was, but it's not. It was a completely different campaign project. It had its own heading. I don't want to get into all the controversies in the historiography, but it made us misunderstand and misinterpret that era. And I think that's the stakes that you're getting at here. It's not just like, one individual did this and one individual did that, but as part of this inoculation attempt, there's a question embedded in here. I'm just kind of laying it out here. But as you were talking and as I was reading this book, I always think about motivations. What motivates individuals who are acting within these larger structures to do the things they do? And I was recently reading the FBI handbook on the handling of confidential human sources, and they go over motivations. What motivates somebody to become an informant? They're various. I mean, there's the obvious ones, to get out of trouble. Let's say they're in a legal bind. Some of it's related to money. They just need money. Some of it's vengeance. They don't like the person that they're informing on. And some of it is just grandeur. They want the celebrity. And I was thinking about, as I was reading this, I was thinking about our class as the intellectual class. And that's what we thrive on. And so in some ways, I'm not saying everyone is an informant, but nonetheless, this industry really propels and speaks to the desires of at least how we're conditioned as academics within the Western academic system to be competitive, to be career oriented in all of these ways. It's the perfect milieu to co-opt and to really capture people into this kind of system and to propel their careers. I mean, even in the most sort of famous examples, I can't remember his name. Richard Aoki, who was the Asian Black Panther. He became a professor, but he was also a paid FBI informant, because he enjoyed the prestige of being somebody who was not only an intellectual but a radical who smuggled guns for the Panthers. And so I mean that's a very kind of on the nose example, but I'm sure there's other examples out there. And I think you can obviously see it in the sort of the explicitly pro-capitalist and pro-empire camp, where of course you have people like Fukuyama who's all over. He's still publishing books. What is he, a neoliberal, neoconservative? I can't even keep up these days. Yeah, it's exactly. Yeah. But I was just thinking of, as I was reading this book, and it's like, it's obvious. And I think what you say that is actually pretty profound, and I didn't think about it, but as I'm searching for sources, it's really hard to find sources that study state surveillance and state influence, not just on social movements, but on the academy and knowledge production. Yeah. Why would they reveal company secrets?
Exactly.
So So how do, my question is, how do we, given all of this and the powers that we're operating against, like, how do we, how do we inoculate ourselves? How do we use, the tools that are laid out in these pages to inoculate ourselves against this kind of system?
I don't know if there's a quick inoculation, because my views on ideology, and actually this is a project that I've been working on with Jennifer Ponce de Leon, is that ideology really has to be understood as a kind of compositional project that formats your ideas, but also your perceptions of the world, your sense of history, your representations, your desires, your affects, how you feel about certain things. You hear the word communism and how do you react to that? Or you hear, whatever word it might be or whatever concept. And so the process of inoculation is actually a process of ideological recomposition. You have to remake yourself in every dimension of your existence, right? Because as I'm sure we both know, there are some really smart people who might have, ideological aspects to their existence that are pervasive at different levels, right? Maybe not in their ideas, but how they perceive the world or their conception of history or other such things. And so I think that I would argue instead in favor of getting plugged into the collective process of remaking ourselves ideologically, because you can't do it in a vacuum, or if you try to do it, you're not going to be as successful as you can if you're plugged into a good community of honest people with integrity who want to change the world, not just misinterpret it. And that you also have to continue to challenge yourself and make sure that you don't kind of slip back into the dominant ideology, because it's not just that you've been programmed, it's that every single interaction you have in the world that we live in is trying to reprogram you in various ways. And I'll connect that maybe to what you were saying about the question of motivation, because a lot of how intellectuals are motivated has to do with climbing the social ladder within the academy. And fame, glory, and money go a long way to explaining why particular intellectuals produce certain types of work, or at least their search for a job or an ability to publish or things like this, if they're not, more narcissistic about it, if you will. And so intellectuals are really trained in the system that we live in to be atomized opportunists, screw over other people, lambaste their ideas, push other people down so you can push yourself up, form your own little fiefdom with like-minded people and drive your product against what other people are doing. I mean, it's a real theoretical practice that is inimical to the types of things that I think you and I are really dedicated to, which is, as an intellectual, I don't want to just be hawking my wares and slandering other people. I want to be in a community where I'm learning, being tested, advancing by also learning from all of the rich things that other people have to contribute. So moving from a kind of opportunist theoretical practice to one that is collective and oriented towards people power, and also being plugged into a tradition that's meaningful. I actually listened to, because I, obviously listened to you on numerous occasions, but the most recent discussion that I heard with you was with Adnan about spirituality. And I thought it was quite interesting, and it was thought-provoking, because I also thought, the work that we're doing is materialist, but it is also a form of work that is really invested in lifting up and being connected to, and I'm going to use this word in a very imminent sense, like not a hocus pocus superstitious sense, but a spirit of struggle, a spirit of camaraderie, a sense of human belonging, that you're part of a shared struggle, and that what you're doing is not just about you. It's about a collective project in which everybody has their part to play. Everybody has something to contribute. There are hierarchies, because some people can fly planes and shoot guns and speak well in public, and other people have other skill sets. Hierarchies can be very useful in that regard, but everybody has something to contribute. And being part of that is really, it's also enriching. Like, I can, at a personal level, attest to the fact that early on, in my 20s, when I was ascending the academic ladder, I definitely had a sense of being an aggressive, I wanted to advance. I wanted to publish. I wanted to get a job. I wanted to go to fancy conferences. What was driving me was I wanted to figure things out, but the opportunism was there even in spite of myself, or it was kind of implicit to the world that I was operating in. And having shifted very far away from that, it's much more enriching to be connected to people who aren't in competition with you, but who actually want to figure things out with you and be part of a shared community of intellectual and practical struggle. Like, what better thing to do with your life instead of, dying and thinking, oh, I slandered some of my colleagues and I pushed my commodities on the marketplace of ideas, and maybe I got some foundation money and worked with the state in the process, and, lots of dead children in the third world, but I didn't see them or whatever. Instead, you can, pass away and think, I'm part of a community of struggle that keeps going on, that I'm plugged into. I made whatever contribution I could, and so did others. And this is what it means to be a human being. It means to be part of something larger than yourself. The most important struggle, which is to make a better world in the very, depressing and colossally destructive world that we've inherited. Maybe the last thing, and I would say, just pivoting to one other thing, is that I really enjoyed what you said about the New Left, and I want to hear more about this project and hope we can do follow-up conversations where I get to ask you more questions about this, because it segues with a lot of my own interests and things that are just important for the movement. And in my own studies of the New Left, you really do have a lot of different competing elements. And if you simplify it to the extreme, you can also see the New Left historically as a kind of fork in the road, where a lot of what comes out of the New Left is this inoculated version of leftism that goes into a kind of anti-communism that then gets translated into identity politics, culturalism, vulgar multiculturalism, and whatnot. But you also have the elements of the New Left that are resolutely anti-imperialist, that are really taking things to the streets, that are serious about transforming things, that recognize racial class struggle, gender class struggle, sexual class struggle. Like, all of these are integral parts of the class struggle, not because they're separate identitarian issues, but because of the way in which empire has tried to subhumanize people and create social hierarchies. And to burst that asunder, we have to deal with these realities, and we can't just segue them, or we can't just use it as a way of segueing into kind of identitarian and culturalist approaches. So the kind of historical materialist dynamic that you get in a lot of the great organizing and theoretical work coming out of some of the movements you were referencing, from the Panthers to the American Indian movement and many, many others, those are traditions that we have to also learn from and carry that history forward, right? Because history is a central site of class struggle. And we need to reconnect our red threads to these traditions that are part of the kind of collective spirit of struggle that I was referencing a moment ago. So I really look forward to following this project and learning from you about it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's really in the early phases, and it's having me like unlearn a lot of what I thought I knew and what we know, like the common assumptions that we have about these movements. And I think the way, that they're remembered, and, it's like the famous question, how do we know what we know? And well, it's like, well, who's telling us what we know? And you start from there, and where are they getting their information? And when you peel it back, you go far enough back, it's coming from a very distorted, place. And so my kind of mantra through all of this is stay true to the sources. What are the sources telling us? And I think, that's what I appreciated, about this book, is it is very much staying true to the sources, and you're not deviating. You're not really, you're contextualizing everything that you're putting in there. And I think it does provide a good model. But I also, in sort of wrapping up this conversation, one question that I had, and we were talking about it before we started the live, but there is backlash already to this book. I've gotten some strange backlash. I'm trying to figure it out. There's, on one hand, I think there's an attack on Monthly Review. There's this idea that Monthly Review is this kind of archaic, institution. I'm a subscriber to Monthly Review. I have been for a while. I really enjoy the stuff that's coming out. They recently did an amazing special volume on the Communes project in Venezuela and how it's connected to anti-imperialism. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's so pertinent to this moment in time. And I think that's just the general sort of anti-communism of the left, but but it's also this strange, it's almost going back to this kind of strange, same arguments of the new left. If it's like, well, we don't like the old left and we're doing something different. There's that sort of critique. And then I think there's this other critique of, or criticism, I don't know what you would call attack, that you're going after these figures and you're dethroning them for some people, like as I wasn't, I didn't have a moment of like, oh my God, Noam Chomsky is hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein, my world is over. I didn't, because I was like, he's a human being, like he's operating within all of these forces, and I'm contextualizing who he is. But I think that there's a Cena keeps throwing up.
Yes, he keeps coming back. Yeah.
I think that like what you're really doing. I have to have a little humor. But I think what you're really doing is unsettling a lot of people's like careers, like their sort of sense of self and all of this. But my question for them, it's not necessarily for you. It's like, if these figures were so great, then why are we here to this day? Like, why are we here having this conversation? But yeah, I want to just maybe ask like what that backlash has been. Has any of it been like productive? I mean, we learn things even from the most idiotic enemy that we may have,
Yeah.
But we also learn things from the very smart ones as well. But I feel like I was, texting my producer Sina, before we got on here. I was like, there's got to be people who are really coming at you in ways that are not about the content of this book, or maybe it is because of the content of this book, because it is dangerous to. And hopefully, like that's the case, because I do think that this is really important work, and it sets in motion, future studies. But yeah, if you want to just maybe answer that question.
Yeah, there has been a backlash, but I have not seen any of it that has been productive. I think that since some people were familiar with a few of the things that I'd written prior to the book, many people just made and have been making outlandish statements on social media that are unfounded because they haven't read the book clearly, and they certainly haven't read anything close to what I read in order to do all the research going into the book. And some of this backlash was anticipated because it's been happening, prior to the book. And so I made sure that I put in the book very explicit statements about conspiracy theories and how we need to understand them, and why it is that there is a form of, there's a way of studying the material reality of capitalist conspiracies that is considered verboten in certain sectors. And I also anticipated, the critiques that would consist in saying, well, Rockhill doesn't know anything about the philosophers that he's studying, even though he reads in all these foreign languages and has been studying them for decades, and even studied under a bunch of them. And so often by people who don't have the credentials that, for what it's worth, I do have. And much of the backlash is quite obviously driven by two factors. One is the threat to the market niche. There's a lot of people who've made a lot of money off of hawking the wares of the radical theory industry that's anti-communist. And they do not want that market niche to dissipate, and they certainly do not want leftist critiques of what they're doing, because they present themselves as being the definition of leftism. So if that be, and I recount this in the book, I actually wrote this book originally in French, and then the contract was canceled by La Fabrique, which is the kind of French equivalent of Verso Books. The reason they did this is because I shared information in the book about elements in the public record that are clear. And as you said, these aren't subjective opinions. I'm not like cranky about something and therefore I'm whining about Adorno or Arendt. I'm pointing out the material historical record regarding Arendt's relationship to the British Foreign Office, as well as Adorno's relationship to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the front organization for the CIA, and other connections that he had. That was too much for La Fabrique because it's their market niche. They publish radical liberal theory that is, if it's Marxist in theory, it's definitely anti-communist in practice. And so they pulled the plug on the entire project. And apparently, according to the lead editor at Verso Books, I'm a persona non grata for life in any of historical materialism's activities, because I guess I'm the one who's a dogmatic Marxist who refuses democracy, whereas they are, of course, not authoritarian and not excluding people and trying to foreclose any debate around the authors that they've been publishing and making money off of for years. The second reason that I just wanted to highlight is that you're right that people have made careers off of being invested in a particular franchise. This is what I was trained to do, right? I was trained in French theory. I originally studied with Derrida, and the career model for me was to be a Derridian, be someone like Jeffrey Bennington or other people like this. I could have made a very lucrative career, likely gotten a foot in, Ivy League institutions. I'd be making 3 or 4 times, if not 6 or 7 times what I'm currently making. And I could publish a lot of books that would really have little to no impact on the types of struggles that I currently support. I then, evolved and had plenty of opportunities to do the same under Bourdieu or under Rancière or other figures that I worked under or close to, but decided not to do that. And so the franchise model is a tried and true model within the academy, particularly within philosophy. And I decided that I wanted to do intellectual work that was not just protecting a franchise as a way of advancing my own personal career. The people who have decided to do that, and particularly those who are advanced in their careers far enough that they're, associate or full professors, they do not want someone like me pointing out the problems with the franchise. And so instead of taking seriously some of the criticisms that I put forth and looking at the material record and critically reflecting on the choices that they've made, which is what I invite people to do in the book, they instead decide to try to kill the messenger by just saying the most outrageous and slanderous things. It's classic red baiting and just ludicrous statements that have nothing to do with anything that I've ever said or published. And I think that a lot of that is just that they feel threatened. They feel threatened that the value of their franchise would be questioned. And so it's quintessential capitalist behavior, both on the part of the platforms that are worried about their market niche, like Verso Books, or on the part of individual academics who have an investment in their particular franchise, meaning that the political economy of knowledge production already goes a long way to explaining their actions. And, to put it in somewhat simple and straightforward terms, like, I knew this was coming. If you read it, actually predicts that it's coming because it is foreseeable. And maybe the final thing that I would say is that I would invite people, if they're invested in a franchise or not, if they've worked with Verso Books or historical materialism or not, just do me one basic favor that has to do with academic integrity and professionalism. Just read the book. Just read it with an open mind and just look at it like any other document that you would take seriously, work through it. You might not agree with all of it, but look at the claims that are made. And if you have disagreements, work through everything that I've read, consult the archives that I've consulted, do the Freedom of Information Acts that I've requested, gather all of that information, come up with an explanatory framework that is superior to this explanatory framework that I have, publish it, and I will read it with great alacrity. And I would be the first person to admit that I'm wrong if I'm indeed wrong about the claims that I make. If instead you just engage in slander and mudslinging, I just don't take you seriously as an intellectual, because you haven't done the level of kind of materialist research that is necessary to take someone seriously as an intellectual. And maybe I said that was the last thing. Let me add one other thing that's a little bit more on a positive note, and that is I didn't write this book for those people. They've been creating problems for me for years. They've been creating problems for a lot of people for years. They're gatekeepers. They are gatekeepers who feel threatened because empire is in decline. And it's lashing out and it has a lot of force, but it is in decline. And they are part of the imperial theory industry and they feel it. They feel the heat, and I want them to feel the heat. I want them to feel questioned. I want them to feel like the solidity of their franchise is questioned. But I wrote this book for the people who are looking for an intellectual framework and a tradition that provides them with tools necessary for understanding the world that they live in, the social totality and the socio-natural totality, so every aspect of that world, and provide them with tools and a method by which they can both intellectually and practically take something away from the book that's not just, hey, this is what Rockhill learned or brought to the fore with the archive, but actually take some of the method away and feel empowered to themselves engage in and push forward this collective tradition of intellectual and practical work. I want to make a contribution to how, Lenin and Lukács and Gramsci and Retamar and a lot of other people have defined what Marxism is. Marxism is a method, right? And that method can be applied in so many different areas, and it constantly needs innovation, new studies, developing new perspectives, right? Bring yourselves into not a camp in this kind of whatever people denigrate as campism, as if like being involved in class struggle is a bad thing, but come over to the side of the collectively rigorous people who want ideas that have use value because they serve the purpose of struggling for a more egalitarian and ecologically sustainable world. And let's leave the kind of backlash and ankle biters to themselves and move on to really focusing on the type of work that we need to do to save the world before it's too late.
I think that's a really excellent way to end this conversation. But before I let you go, Gabriel, in the quickest amount of time that you can, with as much brevity as you can afford, can you just talk about the other 2 volumes, because this is the first of a trilogy, and then talk about where people can find your work?
So I just started a Substack. People can find me there. I also run an educational nonprofit, the Critical Theory Workshop, that's a portal to a lot of the collective projects that I'm involved in. We have a summer school. We have an upcoming class on anti-imperialism. We have a book series and many other things. So please check out that platform. And the next 2 books are, the second volume is called French Theory Made in USA. It's an analysis of the dynamics of cultural imperialism that have promoted so-called postmodern theory as a weapon of war in kind of intellectual class struggle. And the third and final volume is Radical Theories, Infantile Disorder, indexing, of course, Lenin's excellent book on related topics. And it looks at and addresses a question that I often get, which consists in saying, well, Western Marxism and French theory, maybe there are some problems with them, but what about these contemporary radical theorists who are doing Afro-pessimism or the work of Hart and Negri or the work of Badiou or Rancière or these other figures? And so it is pointing out the chameleonic nature of ideology and the fact that the traditions that I've excavated within this first volume are alive and well today, and therefore we have to get much more serious about fighting the intellectual world war in order to win it, instead of allowing the empire to be the victor.
Well, thanks so much, Gabriel. It's as always, it's a pleasure to have you on. And I think I said this about the Lacerda book, and I did actually go back and reread it, but I'm actually going to reread this one again because I was prepping for reading for an interview is much different than reading for because there's some gems in there, some methodological points that you make that I think are adding to my sort of toolbox of thinking. And I just really appreciated this book, not just for its archival breadth, but also the sort of methodological approach that you take. And you're looking at the sort of realm of ideas, and I don't think there are some great Marxist sort of methods for that, but the way that you approached this particular topic, I thought was actually very entertaining to read. And it was not a hard book to read. I mean, you are dealing with a lot of complicated subject matter, but I think if you sit down and study this book, it's gonna be worth it in the end, not only for the information that you learn, but for the methods of inquiry that you put forward. It's just an immense sort of help. And I don't know, like, are there anti-imperialist book awards? But if there are, this should definitely be on the short list at the very least. And I will say, since it's the award, the end of the year and people are making book lists, this is definitely in the top 3 books that I read this year. And I highly recommend it to folks. Go to the Monthly Review website, buy a copy for your friends, buy a copy for your family. Also subscribe to Monthly Review. They have an amazing collection there of journals that come every month, but also books that are being published, and also the anti-imperialist Marxism series that you're running. as well. Check that out. So without further ado, this was just a wonderful conversation, Gabriel, and thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. I look forward to future conversations and continuing to push in the right direction, meaning to the hard left.